Picture this. It is 1994, and FBI agents are sitting in a plain meeting room in Manhattan, staring at a thick folder that has just been made public. Inside are decades of reports, watch notes, and spy briefings. But as they read through the papers, a terrible feeling washes over them. For over 30 years, they have been running one of the most useful spies in organized crime history. They have protected him, paid him, and kept him out of jail. There's just one problem. During all those years of working together, this spy has murdered over 50 people. He has started wars, gotten rid of rivals, and built a crime empire, all while cashing FBI paychecks and feeding them information. His nickname in the criminal world was the Grim Reaper. His real name was Gregory Scarpa Sr., and his story is one of the darkest chapters in the history of both the American Mafia and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is a tale of trickery so deep that, even now, decades later, we are still trying to figure out who was really in control. The mob killer or the federal agents who thought they were in charge of him. Before we dive into one of the most twisted stories in organized crime history, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. And if you are ready for the full story of the mob's most dangerous spy, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you will want to follow along for every shocking detail. Now let us begin. Gregory Scarpa was born on May 8, 1928 in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, New York. He entered a world where organized crime was not just accepted. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. His parents were Italian immigrants who had come to America looking for opportunity. Like millions of others in the great wave of European immigration, his father worked as a laborer, breaking his back for small pay in a neighborhood where other men in expensive suits who commanded respect and fear, seemed to have found an easier path to the American dream. Red Hook in the 1920s and 1930s was a rough waterfront neighborhood, a place where the docks controlled the economy and the mob controlled the docks. The neighborhood was a maze of loading docks, freight warehouses, and narrow apartments where entire families lived, stacked on top of each other. Unemployment was common, police response was slow, and the mob often acted as an unofficial authority. Kids like Scarpa grew up seeing that the men with the most influence were not the politicians or the cops. It was the wise guys who controlled the ports and unions. For a young boy looking for power in a hard environment, the mob was not just appealing, it looked like destiny. Young Gregory grew up watching longshoremen unload cargo ships, but he also watched other deals taking place in the shadows. Gambling operations, loan sharking, protection rackets. The Italian-American community was tight-knit, and within it, the men of honor, the made members of La Cosa Nostra, held a special status. They were respected, feared, and admired all at once. As a child, Scarpa was small for his age, but had a fiery temper that would define his whole life. He had dark eyes that seemed to stare right through people, and even as a young boy, he had a way of making others uncomfortable with his stare. Friends and family members would later recall that there was something different about Gregory. A coldness, a capacity for violence that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. The Scarpa family eventually moved to Bensonhurst, another heavily Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn. If Red Hook had been a rough introduction to street life, Bensonhurst was a graduate education by the 1940s. The neighborhood was firmly under the control of the Profaci crime family, which would later become known as the Colombo family. The social clubs, the corner hangouts, the restaurants, all of them were connected to the mob in some way. Young men in the neighborhood had essentially two paths. They could work real jobs and struggle like their fathers, or they could try to get connected with the wise guys. Gregory Scarpa chose his path early by his teenage years. Scarpa was already involved in street crime. He started small, bookmaking, numbers running, small-time theft. But what made him different from other young wannabe gangsters was his complete lack of hesitation when it came to violence. Most young criminals used violence reluctantly. Seeing it as an unfortunate part of their job, Scarpa seemed to enjoy it. Associates later said that Scarpa did not just use violence as a tool. He treated it almost like a craft. He would study how to scare someone with the least effort, how to break a person mentally before hurting them physically. This obsession with control made him stand out from other young gangsters, who often used violence only when absolutely necessary. His first serious arrest came in his late teens for assault. The details of the case show a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. A small argument had escalated, and Scarpa had responded with huge, unfair violence. He had beaten a man so badly that the victim needed to go to the hospital. Even then, at 17 or 18 years old, Scarpa showed no regret when questioned by police. He was calm, almost detached as he described the beating. But charges were dropped. The victim, whether through fear or persuasion, refused to testify. It was a lesson Scarpa learned early. Violence worked. Violence silenced witnesses. Violence earned respect in his world through his late teens and early 20s. Scarpa continued building his reputation. He was involved in hijackings, stealing trucks full of goods that would then be sold through mob-controlled operations. He ran gambling operations and collected debts for loan sharks. But it was his willingness to hurt people, to really hurt them, that got him noticed by the men who mattered. The Profaci crime family, named after its boss Joe Profaci, was one of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York City alongside the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Bonanno families. The Profaci organization controlled various criminal rackets throughout Brooklyn and beyond. Joe Profaci was known as the olive oil king because of his real business importing olive oil. But his real fortune came from his criminal businesses by the early 1950s. Gregory Scarpa had come to the attention of family members. His reputation for violence had come before him. But the men who ran the family wanted to see if he had the discipline to go along with his viciousness. Being a successful mob associate required more than just a willingness to crack skulls. It required the ability to make money, to follow orders, and to keep your mouth shut. Scarpa proved he could do all 3. His early work for the family involved collections, making sure people paid what they owed. Loan sharking was a major money maker for the mob, and someone needed to visit the people who fell behind on their payments. Scarpa was very good at this work. He had developed a method. He would appear at the debtor's home or workplace, always calm and polite at first. He would explain the situation clearly. You owe money. The interest is adding up, and this needs to be fixed. He gave people a chance to do the right thing, but if they refused, if they tried to plead poverty or avoid their debt, Scarpa would change. The calm behavior would vanish. Replaced by something terrifying, he would cause pain with cold precision. Always careful to hurt without killing, to send a message without creating a body that would bring police attention. And here was the thing that made Scarpa especially effective. He seemed to enjoy it, the fear in his victims' eyes. The pain he caused, it did not bother him at all. If anything, he seemed energized by it. Word spread quickly in the criminal world. Do not cross Greg Scarpa. Pay what you owe. Because the Grim Reaper does not forget. That nickname, the Grim Reaper, started going around in the late 1950s. Different people claim credit for making it up. But the reason for it was clear. When Scarpa came for you, death followed. He had committed his first murder by the mid-1950s. Though the exact details remain fuzzy, what is known is that by 1960, Scarpa had been made, formally brought in as a full member of the crime family. The making ceremony was a sacred ritual in La Cosa Nostra. Scarpa would have been brought to a secret location, probably a basement or back room somewhere in Brooklyn. The senior members of the family would have been there. There would have been a gun and a knife on a table representing the tools of the trade. Scarpa's finger would have been pricked. drawing blood that would be smeared on a card showing a saint. The card would then be set on fire, and Scarpa would have held the burning card repeating the oath of omerta, the code of silence. He swore that he would never betray the family. Witnesses who later worked with law enforcement described these ceremonies as deeply emotional moments, sometimes leaving new members shaking. Men believed they were entering a sacred brotherhood backed by centuries of tradition. For Scarpa, however, the oath seemed to be more about the ritual than true belief. Even as he repeated the words, he had already developed a personal code. Loyalty was useful only when it helped him. He swore that their secrets were his secrets. He swore that he would murder his own family members if ordered to do so by the family bosses. He swore that if he broke this oath, his life should end in flames. Just like the burning card in his hands, it was a sacred oath. The most serious promise a man could make in the mob world within a few years. Gregory Scarpa would break every word of it on the surface. Gregory Scarpa seemed to be living a version of the American dream. In 1956, he married Connie Forrest, a local girl from the neighborhood. They bought a house in Brooklyn and started a family. Over the years, they would have 4 children together. To the neighbors, Greg Scarpa was a family man, a hard worker, someone who provided well for his wife and kids. He drove nice cars and dressed well. But not flashy. He was polite to his neighbors, friendly without being overly close. He kept his lawn neat and his house in good repair on Sundays. The Scarpa family would attend Mass at the local Catholic church. Greg would sit in the pew with his wife and children, his hands folded, his head bowed in prayer. And then on Monday, he might torture someone to death. This double life, family man and remorseless killer, was something Scarpa kept up his whole life. His children knew their father was involved in business, but they did not know the details. Connie knew more, certainly. Mob wives always knew more than they admitted, but there was an understanding, an agreement not to ask too many questions. The money was good, the lifestyle was comfortable. Do not look too closely at how it is all made possible. What Connie did not know, at least not in these early years, was that her husband was building a reputation as one of the most dangerous killers in the whole American Mafia. By the early 1960s, Scarpa had been involved in many murders. Some were approved hits ordered by the family bosses as part of mob business. Others were more personal, scores settled or insults answered. And some seemed to happen simply because Scarpa's quick temper had been set off. One story that went around in the criminal world concerned a small argument over a gambling debt. The debtor, a small-time bookmaker, owed Scarpa money but did not have it. This was a common situation, and usually it would be solved through talk, a payment plan, some kind of agreement. But when this bookmaker tried to explain his situation to Scarpa, he made a big mistake. He raised his voice. He complained too much. He showed disrespect. Scarpa's response was quick and brutal. He beat the man unconscious right there on the street. Then he dragged him into a nearby building and over the course of several hours, tortured him. When he was finally finished, he shot the man in the head and left the body in a dumpster. The murder was not approved by the family bosses. It had not been cleared or agreed to. It was simply Greg Scarpa being Greg Scarpa. Violent, unpredictable, and absolutely terrifying. Most soldiers in the mob would have faced serious punishment for an unapproved murder. You could not just go around killing people without permission. It brought heat, it drew police attention, and it broke the chain of command. But when the family captains heard what Scarpa had done, they did not punish him. They were afraid of him. Even the men who technically outranked him in the organization had learned that Greg Scarpa was not someone you wanted to cross. So they let it slide, and Greg Scarpa learned another valuable lesson. If you are scary enough, you can get away with almost anything. By the early 1960s, Scarpa was a respected and feared member of the Colombo family. He was earning well, bringing in money from various rackets. He had his crew of associates working under him. He had his family at home, the picture of normal home life. And he had his reputation on the streets. The Grim Reaper, the man you did not cross. The killer who seemed to have no conscience at all, what nobody knew, not his wife, not his children, not his fellow mobsters, was that Greg Scarpa was about to make a deal that would change everything. He was about to become something that in the mob world was considered lower than a rat, more hateful than a child molester, more traitorous than Judas himself. Greg Scarpa was about to become an FBI spy. The exact details of Greg Scarpa's first recruitment by the FBI remain somewhat fuzzy, lost in the shadows of government secrecy and different stories. What is written in FBI files is that around 1960, Scarpa was first approached by federal agents as a possible spy. But the story of how and why he agreed to work with them is more complex than a simple arrest and flip. According to some stories, Scarpa was facing serious charges that could have put him away for a long time. The FBI supposedly offered him a deal. Work for us, and these charges disappear. According to other versions, Scarpa went to the FBI himself, seeing a chance to use the government to get rid of his rivals while protecting his own crime business. Like so much in Scarpa's story, the truth is probably somewhere in between, or perhaps it is both. Scarpa saw the power the FBI had over him and decided to turn it to his advantage. What we know for sure is that by 1961, Gregory Scarpa had been officially labeled as a top echelon spy for the FBI. This was the highest category of spy, save for those with access to the inner workings of organized crime. Top echelon spies were considered so valuable that they received special handling and protection. The FBI was willing to overlook certain criminal activities by these spies in exchange for information about organized crime. The question was, what criminal activities was the FBI willing to overlook? In Scarpa's case, the answer turned out to be almost everything. Even internal notes show a surprising tolerance for Scarpa's activities. Agents quietly wrote down violent attacks, extortion plans, and suspected murders, yet rarely moved to charge him. Every time Scarpa got away with something, the relationship deepened, tying the FBI tighter into a morally impossible deal. Scarpa learned early that as long as he produced information, he was basically untouchable from the very beginning. His relationship with the FBI was unlike typical spy arrangements. Most spies gave information about crimes committed by others. They wore wires, went to meetings, and reported back to their handlers. They might still be involved in criminal activity, but generally at a lower level. Bookmaking, loan sharking, that kind of thing. Violence was supposed to be off the table. Greg Scarpa did not operate that way. He continued his criminal career without any clear change. He continued running his rackets. He continued collecting bets with violence. And most shockingly, he continued murdering people. The FBI's reason was that Scarpa's information was too valuable to lose. He was giving intelligence about the Colombo family leadership, about meetings and planned hits, about the broader structure of La Cosa Nostra in New York. The Bureau convinced itself that by keeping Scarpa as an active spy, they were serving the greater good, even if individual crimes had to be allowed along the way. It was an excuse that would eventually lead to disaster, but in the early 1960s, as the FBI was increasing its war against organized crime, the agency believed it had found a golden asset in Greg Scarpa. They had no idea that they were actually dealing with the devil. In June 1964, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared in Mississippi. They had been in the state as part of the Freedom Summer campaign, working to register black voters in an era when such work was met with violent resistance from white supremacists. The 3 young men were taken by Ku Klux Klan members, murdered, and their bodies buried in an earthen dam. The case became a national scandal. President Lyndon Johnson ordered the FBI to find the missing men and bring those responsible to justice. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had long been reluctant to involve the Bureau in civil rights cases, was under intense political pressure to solve the crime. Dozens of agents went to Mississippi, but they hit a wall. In a community where law enforcement was often working with the Klan, where witnesses were terrified to talk, the FBI was making no progress. The bodies remained hidden. The killers remained free, and the FBI was desperate. Someone in the Bureau had an idea: bring in Greg Scarpa. What happened next remains one of the most argued episodes in FBI history. According to papers that came out decades later, as well as testimony from people involved, the FBI flew Greg Scarpa to Mississippi in June or July 1964. The official story was that Scarpa was there as a kind of undercover agent, using his skills to get information from possible witnesses. The real story was darker. Scarpa was taken to meet Lawrence Byrd, a local appliance store owner and Klan member who the FBI believed had information about where the bodies were buried. The FBI agents brought Scarpa to Byrd's store and left them alone. What happened next was never officially written down, but the stories that have come out are chilling. Scarpa supposedly kidnapped Byrd, taking him to a remote location. There, using methods he had perfected in his mob career, Scarpa tortured the man. He beat him, according to some stories. He put a gun in Byrd's mouth and threatened to blow his head off. He told Byrd that he was going to die unless he told where the bodies were located. Byrd talked. For investigators, it was the breakthrough they desperately needed. But for the FBI leadership, it also became a dangerous example. Proof that Scarpa could get results traditional law enforcement could not. The success overshadowed the ethical nightmare behind it. And once the door was opened, there was no closing it. Scarpa had just proven his usefulness in the most brutal way possible. He gave up the location of the earthen dam, where the 3 civil rights workers had been buried. Within hours, the FBI had dug up the site and found the bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The case that had stumped the Bureau for weeks had been solved. Thanks to Greg Scarpa's torture of a Klan member, the FBI was overjoyed. Scarpa was paid for his work and sent back to New York. The Mississippi case was officially solved through investigation and surveillance. The torture was never mentioned in official reports. Scarpa's involvement was hidden in secret files. For decades, this story was dismissed as an urban legend, a dark rumor whispered about, but never confirmed. But in the 1990s and 2000s, as FBI documents were released and people came forward, the truth came out. The FBI had used a mob killer to torture information out of a Klan member. The end had justified the means. The bodies were found. Justice was served. 7 men were eventually convicted in connection with the murders. And if it required using a monster to catch monsters, well, that was the price of doing business. But there was a deeper cost that the FBI did not fully calculate at the time. By using Scarpa for the Mississippi case, by seeing how effective his methods were, the Bureau had cemented the idea that Greg Scarpa was an essential asset. He was too valuable to lose. He was too effective to control. It was a decision that would eventually cost dozens of lives. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, Greg Scarpa lived a triple life that would have been impossible for most people to keep up. There was Greg, the family man, husband to Connie, and father to his children. There was Greg the mobster, a rising star in the Colombo family. And there was Greg, the FBI spy, meeting regularly with his handlers and giving intelligence about organized crime. Each identity was carefully kept separate. At home, he was the provider, the father who took his kids to school and went to their school events. In the mob, he was the Grim Reaper, the enforcer who solved problems with violence. And with the FBI, he was a cooperative source, a valuable asset in the war against La Cosa Nostra. But these identities did not just exist side by side. They fed off each other in disturbing ways. Scarpa would go to mob meetings where criminal activities were discussed. Then he would meet with his FBI handler and give intelligence about what had been discussed. But here is where it gets complicated. Scarpa did not just report on crimes that others were committing. He reported on crimes he himself was involved in, sometimes even crimes he was planning. He would describe a planned robbery or extortion scheme in detail to the FBI, then go ahead and take part in it. The FBI, in theory, was supposed to prevent crimes when possible, but in practice, the Bureau often let Scarpa's criminal activities go on. The reason was always the same: if they moved to stop these crimes, they would blow Scarpa's cover, they would lose their source, and the intelligence he was giving was too valuable to risk. So the crimes continued. Scarpa's FBI file from this time, parts of which have been released, shows a pattern of reports about various criminal activities. Loan sharking operations, hijackings, attacks. But there is a curious absence in many of these reports. Follow-up law enforcement actions. Scarpa would report a crime. The information would be filed away, and then nothing. No arrests, no involvement, no consequences. His FBI handler during much of this time was Special Agent Anthony Villano. Later, the relationship would change to a different agent, a man named Lindley DeVecchio, who would become the most argued person in this whole story. But in these early years with Villano, the pattern was set. Scarpa gave information. The FBI protected him, and both sides pretended that there was a clear line between spy and criminal. There was not while he was informing for the FBI. Scarpa's mob career was growing in the late 1960s. A big change came to the crime family he belonged to. Joe Profaci, the longtime boss, died in 1962 after a time of internal conflict known as the First Colombo War. The family came under the control of Joseph Colombo Sr. in 1963. The family was renamed in his honor, becoming the Colombo crime family. Scarpa had remained loyal through the internal conflicts, and his loyalty was rewarded by the late 1960s. He had been promoted to the position of captain or caporegime. This was a big step up in the mob ladder as a captain. Scarpa now controlled his own crew of soldiers and associates. He had power over criminal operations in a specific area. He reported directly to the family administration, the boss, underboss, and consigliere. Being a captain meant more money, more respect, and more responsibility. It also meant more access to secret information, which made him even more valuable to the FBI. Scarpa's crew worked mostly out of Brooklyn. His criminal businesses were varied and profitable: loan sharking, where he would lend money at very high interest rates and then collect with violence if needed; extortion, especially of local businesses who paid protection money; illegal gambling operations, hijacking of trucks and cargo, and various other rackets. But the real money came from something else: murder for hire. By the 1970s, Scarpa had developed a reputation as someone who could be hired to kill people. Not just mob hits, though he certainly did those, but contract murders for anyone willing to pay if you had an enemy you wanted gone. If there was someone standing between you and money or power, Greg Scarpa could solve that problem for you for a price. His methods were varied. Sometimes it was a straightforward shooting, a victim ambushed on the street or gunned down in their car. Sometimes it was more detailed. He was known to use strangulation, stabbing, and in at least one case, burying someone alive. The change in methods seems to have been more about practicality than preference, though associates later said that Scarpa seemed to like the more hands-on killings. A gunshot was quick and impersonal. Strangulation was close, personal. You looked into your victim's eyes as the life drained out of them. Greg Scarpa apparently preferred looking into those eyes. His crew members were fiercely loyal, partly out of respect, but mostly out of fear. Scarpa demanded absolute obedience from those under him. If you worked for Greg Scarpa, you did what you were told. When you were told, without question. Associates who disappointed him tended to disappear. The message was clear. Loyalty was everything, and disloyalty was a death sentence. Through all of this, Scarpa continued meeting with his FBI handlers. He would give information about other mob activities, about other families, about the broader structure of organized crime in New York. He gave them intelligence about drug trafficking, about political corruption, about the takeover of labor unions. Some of this information was undoubtedly valuable. Arrests were made based on Scarpa's intelligence. Prosecutions moved forward. But here is the question that haunts this whole story. What was the FBI willing to overlook to keep Scarpa as a spy? And more troublingly, was Scarpa using the FBI to get rid of his rivals while protecting his own operations? Evidence suggests the answer to that second question is yes. There are written cases where Scarpa gave information to the FBI about criminal activities by rival mobsters or members of his own family who he had fights with. The FBI would then move on these individuals, using Scarpa's information as the basis for investigations and arrests. Meanwhile, Scarpa's own crew worked with relative safety. He was in effect using the FBI as a weapon against his enemies. And the FBI, whether through ignorance or willful blindness, was allowing it to happen in 1980. A change happened that would define the most argued phase of Greg Scarpa's career as a spy. His handling was transferred to Special Agent Lindley DeVecchio, a rising star in the FBI's New York office who specialized in organized crime investigations. DeVecchio was ambitious and talented. He had joined the FBI in 1965 and had worked his way up through the ranks. By 1980, he was one of the supervisory agents in charge of the Colombo family investigation. Taking over Scarpa as a spy was seen as a good assignment. Here was a captain in a major crime family, a top echelon spy with access to the highest levels of the organization. The relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa would eventually become the subject of criminal investigations, federal trials, and endless argument. Critics would say that DeVecchio became too close to his spy, that the line between agent and criminal blurred, and that DeVecchio may have been involved in murders. DeVecchio's defenders would argue that he was simply a dedicated agent, making use of a valuable source in the war against the mob. What is undeniable is that under DeVecchio's handling, Greg Scarpa worked with extraordinary freedom. The FBI's own internal reviews would later note worries about the relationship. Other agents whispered that DeVecchio had become too personally involved with Scarpa. There were questions about whether information was flowing in both directions. Was Scarpa informing the FBI, or was the FBI informing Scarpa? The two men met regularly throughout the 1980s, usually in cars or remote locations where they would not be seen. Scarpa would give information about Colombo family activities, about pending mob actions, about the family leadership. DeVecchio would pay him. Spies received regular cash payments from the FBI. The amounts varied, but Scarpa was well paid for his cooperation. But what else might have been talked about in those meetings? Did DeVecchio warn Scarpa about pending investigations into his activities? Did he give information about rival mobsters that Scarpa could use to his advantage? These questions would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. What we know from FBI records is that throughout the 1980s, even as Scarpa was committing many murders, his status as a spy protected him. There were investigations into various crimes where Scarpa was a suspect. There was evidence pointing to his involvement. But somehow these investigations never quite resulted in charges. Evidence would be called insufficient. Witnesses would take back their stories, leads would go cold. And all the while Greg Scarpa continued meeting with Agent DeVecchio, continued giving information, and continued working as one of the most violent mobsters in New York. In 1986, Something happened that would eventually add to Greg Scarpa's downfall. Though it would remain a secret for years, Scarpa needed ulcer surgery and received a blood transfusion during the operation. The blood, sadly, was contaminated. Greg Scarpa caught HIV in 1986. HIV and AIDS were still not fully understood. It was a death sentence, and it carried great shame. For a man like Scarpa, hypermasculine, violent, living in a world where any sign of weakness could be deadly, an HIV diagnosis was catastrophic. Not just medically, but socially and professionally. Scarpa kept it secret. He told almost no one. Not even his wife, Connie, as far as his mob associates knew. Their captain was healthy and strong, still the terrifying enforcer he had always been. But privately, Scarpa was dealing with a ticking clock. He knew that eventually the virus would progress to full-blown AIDS. He knew that his time was limited. Some psychologists and crime experts who have studied Scarpa's later behavior believe that the HIV diagnosis added to his increasing violence in the late 1980s and early 1990s. A man who already had limited self-control and a tendency for violence now knew he was dying. What limits existed on his behavior became even weaker. If he was going to die anyway, why hold back? But there was someone Scarpa did tell about his diagnosis. Linda Skiro, by the mid-1980s. Greg Scarpa was living yet another double life, this time in his personal relationships. While still married to Connie and living in the family home, Scarpa had started a relationship with a woman named Linda Skiro. She was younger than him, attractive, and unlike Connie. She was fully aware of what Scarpa did for a living. Linda became his mistress, his confidant, the person he spent more and more of his time with. He set her up in an apartment and eventually bought her a house. They had children together. It was in many ways a second complete family. Parallel to his first family, but separate, Connie knew about Linda. Of course, mob wives always knew, but there was an understanding, an acceptance that this was simply how things were in their world. Many mobsters had mistresses, girlfriends on the side. It was considered almost a perk of the lifestyle. A sign of success, Connie kept her dignity, kept the family home, and did not make waves. But Linda's role in Scarpa's life would turn out to be important for another reason. She saw things that Connie did not see. She heard things. Scarpa was more open with Linda about his criminal activities. He would come to her after committing murders, sometimes with blood still on his clothes. He would tell her details about his crimes, about his spy relationship with the FBI, about his plans and schemes. Years later, Linda Skiro would become a key witness for federal prosecutors. Her testimony would give an insider's view into Scarpa's criminal activities, confirming what investigators had long suspected but struggled to prove. She would describe murders she had knowledge of, meetings she had seen, conversations she had heard. But in the 1980s, Linda was simply the other woman, the mistress of a dangerous mobster who was living on borrowed time. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Greg Scarpa's body count continued to rise. Exact numbers are impossible to check. Many bodies were never found. Many murders were never officially connected to him. But investigators who have studied Scarpa's career guess that he personally killed at least 50 people and possibly many more. Some of these were approved mob hits, agreed to by the family leadership when the Colombo family bosses decided that someone needed to be eliminated. A spy, a rival, someone who had broken mob rules. Scarpa was often the man they called. He was reliable, efficient, and completely without regret. One such approved hit happened in 1987. Joseph De Domenico was a Colombo family associate who was suspected of working with law enforcement. In the mob, there's no greater sin than being a rat. The penalty is always the same: death. Scarpa was given the contract, according to later court testimony. Scarpa and members of his crew tricked De Domenico to a meeting under false reasons. When Domenico arrived, he was ambushed. Scarpa shot him many times, killing him. The body was then gotten rid of, and Domenico became one of the many murder victims, whose disappearance would never be officially solved. The irony was rich. Greg Scarpa, one of the most productive FBI spies in history, murdering someone for the crime of informing to law enforcement. But not all of Scarpa's murders were approved. His quick temper meant that scene insults or slights could turn deadly at a moment's notice. There are stories of Scarpa murdering people over gambling arguments, over scene disrespect, even over small traffic incidents. His crew members learned to be very careful around him, especially when he had been drinking. An offhand comment or a poorly timed joke could result in a bullet to the head. One particularly chilling story from this time involves a young man who supposedly cheated at cards during a game at one of Scarpa's social clubs. The amount of money involved was small, a few hundred at most, but Scarpa saw it as disrespect, a breaking of the rules in his place, according to witness testimony that came out years later. Scarpa took the young man into a back room and beat him to death with a baseball bat. The body was then taken away and gotten rid of, and the card game continued. The casual nature of the violence was perhaps the most disturbing part for Greg Scarpa. Murder was not an extraordinary event needing justification or deep thought. It was simply a tool, a method of solving problems or satisfying his rage. He killed the way other people might fire an employee or end a business relationship, with cold calculation and no clear emotional after effect. And through all of this, the FBI kept their relationship with him. Agent DeVecchio continued meeting with Scarpa, continued receiving information, continued filing reports in the FBI's system. Scarpa remained labeled as a valuable asset, a top echelon spy whose cooperation was worth protecting. The question that would later haunt everyone involved was simple. At what point does the cost of a spy outweigh their value? At what point do the crimes they commit while informing become unacceptable? For the FBI, that point should have come much sooner. But it did not, and as the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the full cost of the Bureau's relationship with Greg Scarpa was about to become devastatingly clear. By 1990, the Colombo crime family was heading toward internal conflict. Tensions were building that would eventually explode into the most violent mob war New York had seen in decades. And at the center of that war, manipulating events and bodies, would be Greg Scarpa, still informing to the FBI, still committing murders, still playing all sides against each other. The darkest chapter of his story was about to begin. As the 1980s progressed, Greg Scarpa's crime empire grew significantly. His crew had grown to include many soldiers and associates, all of whom worked under his command and all of whom added to his income. The various rackets he controlled were creating huge sums of money. Guesses suggest that by the mid-1980s, Scarpa was earning millions of dollars each year from his criminal activities. Loan sharking remained a core business. Scarpa would lend money at interest rates that ranged from 1% to 5% per week. Rates that sound small until you calculate the yearly percentages. A 1% weekly rate translates to about 67% each year when added up. Borrowers who could not keep up with payments would find themselves in an ever-deepening hole, owing far more than they first borrowed, and when they could not pay, Scarpa would take payment in other forms. Their businesses, their homes, even their labor. There are written cases of business owners who borrowed from Scarpa and ended up basically signing their businesses over to him when they could not repay. Restaurants, construction companies, real businesses of various types. All of them became part of Scarpa's collection through debt collection. Once he owned a piece of a business, he would use it for various purposes, money laundering, no-show jobs for his associates, or simply as a real source of income. Extortion was another major income stream, the classic protection racket. "Pay us, and we will make sure nothing bad happens to your business" was alive and well in Scarpa's Brooklyn area. Business owners, especially those in industries that the mob had traditionally controlled, like construction, waste management, and the waterfront, paid regular tribute to Scarpa. Those who refused to pay would experience unfortunate incidents: fires, vandalism, attacks on employees, or worse. One particular extortion case from this time shows Scarpa's methods. A construction company owner, we will call him John. His real identity was protected in court documents. Refused to pay Scarpa's demanded protection money. He thought he could resist, that he could go to the police or simply hold firm. Scarpa's response was methodical and terrifying. First, John's car was firebombed. A warning shot when John still refused to pay. His construction office was burned down in the middle of the night. Equipment was destroyed. Then came the physical scare. John was beaten by members of Scarpa's crew. Finally, Scarpa made it personal. He showed up at John's home where John's wife and children lived. He did not threaten them openly. He did not have to. The message was clear. Pay or everyone you love is at risk. John paid, and he kept paying for years. This was the reality of Scarpa's business operations. Violence was not the last choice. It was a basic part of the business plan. And because Scarpa enjoyed violence, because he was good at it, his area was very profitable. Other mobsters might hesitate before escalating to serious violence. Scarpa never hesitated. Scarpa's crew in the 1980s was a group of violent criminals who were loyal to him through a mix of fear, respect, and financial reason among the key members. Larry Mazza was one of Scarpa's most trusted associates. Interestingly, Mazza came into Scarpa's circle through Linda Skiro. He had been her daughter's boyfriend, but he fell under Scarpa's influence and eventually became one of his most reliable soldiers. Mazza would take part in many crimes with Scarpa, including several murders years later. He would work with authorities and give detailed testimony about the crew's activities. Joe Skiro, Linda's brother, was another crew member. Family connections in Scarpa's crew were wide, creating a tight-knit organization where loyalty was strengthened by blood relations. There were others whose names appeared in FBI watch reports and later in court documents. Mario Parla Greco, Carmen Cacchiano, and various other associates who moved through Scarpa's crew over the years. Some remained loyal until the end. Others eventually turned government witness, and some simply disappeared, victims of Scarpa's paranoia or temper. Running a crew required managing personalities, settling arguments, and keeping discipline. Scarpa was effective at this, but his methods were brutal. If crew members had fights with each other, Scarpa would settle them, often with violence. If someone was suspected of holding back money or cheating the organization, Scarpa would investigate, and the punishment would be severe. There are accounts from crew members who later worked with authorities that describe a culture of fear within Scarpa's organization. Yes, there was money to be made, and yes, there was the prestige of being connected to a powerful captain. But everyone knew that crossing Greg Scarpa meant death. His paranoia increased over the years, especially after his HIV diagnosis. He saw possible betrayal everywhere, and he dealt with it before it happened. One former associate later testified that Scarpa once became convinced that another crew member was taking money for himself, without doing any real investigation, without giving the accused any chance to defend himself. Scarpa simply had him killed. It later turned out that the suspicions were wrong. The crew member had been loyal and honest, but by then he was dead. His body dissolved in acid or buried in a location known only to Scarpa and the men who helped him dig the hole. This was the atmosphere in Scarpa's crew. Productive and profitable, but soaked in blood and terror. By the mid-1980s, Scarpa had also become involved in the drug trade. Despite the traditional mafia rule against drug dealing, the mafia's official position on drugs was complex. Many bosses publicly said that dealing drugs was forbidden, that it brought too much heat from law enforcement. But the reality was that the huge profits from narcotics were too tempting to resist. Scarpa's involvement in drugs was carefully structured to keep believable denial. He would not handle drugs himself, and he would not be directly involved in street-level dealing. Instead, he would finance drug operations, provide protection, and take a percentage of the profits. It was a classic mob approach. Let others take the risks while you collect the rewards. The cocaine trade in 1980s New York was very profitable. Scarpa would provide money to drug dealers, basically fronting them large amounts of cocaine on credit. The dealers would sell the drugs, return Scarpa's investment plus interest, and everyone made money. If a dealer lost the drugs or could not pay, well, that was what Scarpa's enforcement skills were for. There are signs in FBI files that Scarpa was connected to drug operations that brought cocaine from South America through various channels. The exact details are fuzzy. Drug operations were kept deliberately separate. But the money flowing through Scarpa's organization in this time suggests major narcotics involvement. The FBI knew about at least some of this drug activity. It appeared in reports that Scarpa himself gave to his handlers, but again, we see the same pattern. The information was written down, filed away, and no serious law enforcement action was taken against Scarpa himself. He was too valuable as a spy. The drug dealing was seen as the cost of keeping him as a source. By 1987 or 1988, Scarpa's HIV had progressed. He was having symptoms: tiredness, weight loss, returning infections. He looked for treatment from doctors, but this was the late 1980s, before the arrival of truly effective antiretroviral therapies. The outlook was grim. HIV infection inevitably progressed to AIDS, and AIDS was deadly. The only question was how long he had. Scarpa managed to keep his condition secret from most of his mob associates. In that world, at that time, HIV and AIDS carried huge shame. There were widespread misunderstandings about how it was passed, and being HIV positive would have raised questions about Scarpa's sexuality or drug use. Neither guess would have been acceptable in the hyper-masculine, homophobic culture of the mob, but Linda knew. She was with him at doctor's appointments. She knew about his medications, about his failing health. And according to her later testimony, she was terrified both of the disease and of what it meant for her future. If Greg died, what would happen to her? She was a mob mistress with children, dependent on Scarpa's criminal income. Without him, she would have nothing. Did the FBI know about Scarpa's HIV status? This remains a subject of debate. Linda Skiro later claimed that Greg had told Agent DeVecchio about his diagnosis. The FBI has denied this, saying that Scarpa's medical information was not in his spy file. But if DeVecchio did know, it raises troubling questions. A spy with a terminal illness becomes even more unpredictable. The limits that might normally control behavior, fear of prison, worry about the future, disappear when you know you are dying anyway, whether the FBI knew or not. Scarpa's behavior in the late 1980s and early 1990s became increasingly reckless and violent. He seemed to stop calculating results. If he wanted someone dead, they died. Without the careful planning and political thoughts that usually govern mob hits. One incident from this time shows his worsening judgment. A neighborhood resident, someone who was not involved in organized crime at all, had some kind of small argument with one of Scarpa's associates. The exact nature of the argument is unclear. Different accounts suggest it was about a parking space or a personal insult. Whatever the cause, Scarpa decided to involve himself. He showed up at the man's apartment building and shot him many times in the lobby. In front of witnesses, it was bold, reckless, the kind of public violence that mobsters usually avoided because it brought police attention. But Scarpa did not seem to care. He walked away from the shooting and returned home as if nothing had happened. The police investigated, of course. Witnesses were questioned, but somehow no charges resulted. The investigation went cold years later. It would come out that the FBI might have stepped in to protect their spy, perhaps suggesting to local police that Scarpa was involved in a sensitive federal investigation and should not be arrested. If true, this represents one of the worst examples of the FBI putting spy protection over public safety and justice. By the late 1980s, the FBI was in a difficult position with Greg Scarpa on one hand. He was giving valuable intelligence about the Colombo family and organized crime more broadly. His reports helped build cases against other mobsters. His information added to successful prosecutions. On the other hand, Scarpa was committing serious crimes, including murders while working as a spy. Other FBI agents were becoming aware of the situation and raising concerns within the FBI's New York office. There were whispers about Scarpa and his handler, Agent DeVecchio. Was the relationship too close? Was Scarpa being protected? There's a government idea called capture that is relevant here. It refers to a situation where a regulator or law enforcement officer becomes so aligned with the subject, they are supposed to be watching that they begin to protect or allow that subject rather than controlling them. Critics would later say that this is exactly what happened with DeVecchio and Scarpa, that the agent became so invested in his spy, so dependent on the intelligence and the career benefits it provided, that he lost objectivity. Internal FBI memos from this time, released decades later, show that some supervisory agents were asking questions about Scarpa. Why was he not being investigated for crimes that he was clearly involved in? Why was evidence against him not being pursued? The answers they received were always the same. Scarpa is a valuable spy. His intelligence is critical. We need to keep their relationship. But some agents were not satisfied with these answers. They believed that Scarpa had effectively captured his handlers, that he was using the FBI as his personal protection service while continuing to murder people. They believed that the Bureau had lost control of the situation. These concerns would eventually prove to be entirely correct. As the 1980s ended and the 1990s began, Scarpa's paranoia grew stronger. He saw enemies everywhere. He suspected that other mobsters were plotting against him. He worried that someone in his crew might be a spy. The irony of this fear apparently escaped him completely. This paranoia led to more violence. Scarpa began striking before it happened against people he suspected of disloyalty or betrayal, often with little evidence. A crew member who seemed too friendly with members of another mob family might be killed on suspicion of being disloyal. Someone who asked too many questions might disappear. Linda Skiro later testified about this time, describing Scarpa's increasing instability. He would fly into rages over small issues. He would spend hours thinking over scene slights or threats. And he would solve these fixations with murder. The FBI was getting intelligence about these activities through their meetings with Scarpa. He would sometimes tell his handlers about murders after the fact, explaining them as necessary for his position within the mob. The FBI would write down these admissions in reports that were kept secret and never led to prosecutions. This created a strange situation. The FBI had written evidence that their spy was committing murders, and they were choosing not to act on that evidence. In any normal situation, in any normal spy relationship, this would have led to immediate ending of the spy arrangement and criminal prosecution. But with Scarpa, the rules seemed different. The FBI had invested decades in developing him as a source. They had protected him, paid him, shielded him from prosecution. To turn on him now would be to admit that they had been allowing a serial killer. So they did not turn on him. They kept the relationship, justified it as necessary for the greater good, and hoped that somehow the arrangement would not blow up in their faces. But by 1991, events beyond anyone's control were about to make that hope impossible. The Colombo crime family was heading towards civil war, and Greg Scarpa was going to be right in the middle of it. The blood that was about to be spilled would raise questions about FBI involvement that have never been fully answered. And it would finally expose the true cost of the devil's deal the Bureau had made with the Grim Reaper. To understand the Colombo War, we need to step back and understand the power structure of the family in the early 1990s. The official boss of the Colombo family was Carmine, the Snake, Persico. But Persico had a big problem. He was in prison, serving a 139-year sentence for racketeering from his federal prison cell. Persico tried to keep control over the family through messages passed through his son, Alphonse "Alley Boy" Persico, and other loyalists. Managing a crime family from prison is very difficult, even with coded messages, loyal messengers, and a network of old-school soldiers. Persico's influence could only go so far from behind steel bars. Every order he gave risked being delayed, misunderstood, or outright ignored. Power in the mob is built on presence, the ability to look someone in the eye, reward loyalty, or punish betrayal from prison. Persico could do none of that, creating a leadership hole that grew larger with every passing month. You cannot go to meetings, you cannot personally settle arguments, and you cannot use the force of your presence to keep discipline. Other ambitious members of the family inevitably begin to think that maybe they could do a better job, that maybe it is time for new leadership. Victor "Little Vic" Orena was one such ambitious member. Orena was a Colombo capo, a captain with his own crew based in Long Island. He was wealthy, respected, and increasingly unhappy with Persico's leadership, or lack of it, from prison. Orena began to position himself as an alternative to the Persico group. He argued that the family needed active leadership, someone who could actually be present to run operations, not someone sending messages from a prison cell. At first, this was not an open rebellion, it was more of a quiet positioning, building alliances, gathering support. Some capos and soldiers moved toward Orena, others remained loyal to Persico. The family was dividing into two camps, and tensions were building. Greg Scarpa was firmly in the Persico camp. For Scarpa, loyalty was not just tradition. It was strategy. He knew the Persicos controlled the older bloodlines, the crews with deep institutional memory, and the soldiers who valued order. Siding with Persico meant siding with history, and Scarpa, already argued and feared, knew that breaking with tradition would leave him open to every grudge and revenge he had collected. This was not surprising. Scarpa had been with the family for decades. He had relationships with the old guard, and he understood that loyalty to the boss, even an imprisoned boss, was traditionally rewarded. But there was also a practical element to Scarpa's loyalty. He needed the protection that came with being on the winning side of family politics. Because by 1991, Scarpa had collected many enemies. He had killed people without permission. He had pushed in on other people's rackets. He had made himself very wealthy, but also very hated. If the Persico group fell, if Orena took control of the family, Scarpa knew he would be vulnerable. Orena's supporters might decide to settle old scores. So Scarpa had every reason to make sure that did not happen. Exactly how the Colombo War started is a matter of debate, with different people giving different accounts. But most historians of organized crime date the beginning to mid-1991, when tensions between the Persico and Orena groups reached a breaking point. There are claims, never proven but widely believed, that Greg Scarpa played a part in starting the conflict. Some law enforcement officials believe that Scarpa, recognizing that war was inevitable, decided to strike first, and strike hard by attacking Orena group members before they could organize themselves. By doing so, Scarpa could help ensure a Persico victory and get rid of some of his personal enemies in the process. On June 20, 1991, a Colombo soldier named Joseph Scopo was ambushed outside a social club in Queens. Multiple gunmen opened fire, hitting Scopo many times. Remarkably, he survived the attack, but the message was clear. This was no longer just political moving, this was war in mob culture. An attempted hit is often more meaningful than a successful one. Surviving an ambush sends shockwaves through every crew. It signals that boundaries have broken, that talks have failed, and that bloodshed is now the main language. The Scarpa attack electrified the whole family. Members stopped sleeping at their homes, switched cars daily, and began carrying many firearms. The time of diplomacy was over. The Arena group blamed Scarpa and the Persico loyalists. They began taking precautions, traveling with bodyguards, changing their routines, arming themselves. They also began planning payback. Over the summer of 1991, the violence escalated. There were shootings, attempted hits, and increasing threats. Members of both groups were looking over their shoulders, wondering who would be targeted next. The social clubs where mobsters traditionally gathered became dangerous places. Nobody felt safe, and through all of this, Greg Scarpa was meeting regularly with FBI agent DeVecchio, giving intelligence about what was happening in the family. He was describing the split, identifying which capos were siding with Arena, discussing the potential for violence. But here is where it gets fuzzy. Was Scarpa simply reporting events, or was he helping to plan them? And more troublingly, was Agent DeVecchio giving information back to Scarpa that helped him target Arena group members? These questions would eventually lead to criminal charges against DeVecchio, though he was finally found not guilty. But the evidence that came out during investigations and trials painted a deeply troubling picture of the FBI's role in the Colombo War. By late 1991 and into 1992, the Colombo War had become a full-scale conflict. Both sides were actively hunting each other. Shootings became almost routine. Mobsters were being killed in the streets, in their cars, outside their homes. The violence was new for the New York mob in this time. The days of the big mob wars of the 1970s and 1980s were supposed to be over. Greg Scarpa was at the center of the violence, personally involved in multiple murders and attempted murders. He seemed to be enjoying the war, the chance to use violence without limit. And his methods were brutal, even by mob standards. On October 20th, 1991, an Arena Group soldier named Nicholas "Nicky Black" Grancio was shot to death outside his home in Brooklyn. The killing was professional and efficient. Grancio was ambushed as he arrived home, shot many times by gunmen who then fled in a waiting car. Later testimony from cooperating witnesses would show that Scarpa had personally ordered and planned the hit. On November 18, 1991, another Arena loyalist, Vincent Fusaro, was shot many times while sitting in his car. He survived but was seriously hurt again. Scarpa was believed to be behind the attack. The pattern continued through 1992. Joseph Campanella murdered, Hank Smurra murdered, Frank Pontillo murdered. Each killing was blamed on the Colombo War, and each one added to the body count that would eventually go over a dozen dead and many more wounded. But Scarpa was not just ordering hits, he was personally taking part in them. According to later court testimony from Linda Skiro and from Larry Mazza, who eventually became a government cooperator, Scarpa would go out on these hits himself despite being in his 60s and increasingly sick from AIDS. He would carry weapons, take part in the planning, and sometimes be the trigger man. Linda Skiro testified about many times when Scarpa came home with blood on his clothes. Excited and energized by the violence, she described how he would talk about the hits, giving details about how they had ambushed someone or how the victim had looked when they died. These were not descriptions from a man who found violence regrettable but necessary. These were the words of someone who enjoyed it throughout the Colombo War. Greg Scarpa continued meeting with Agent DeVecchio. He was giving intelligence about the conflict, who was sided with whom, what attacks were being planned, how the war was going from the FBI's point of view. Scarpa was a priceless window into an ongoing mob conflict. But evidence came out suggesting that information was also flowing in the opposite direction. There are signs that Scarpa received information from the FBI about Arena group members, where they could be found, what their routines were, who their associates were. This intelligence would have been very valuable for someone planning hits. One of the most argued claims concerns the murder of Lorenzo Lampassi on May 22, 1992. Lampassi was an Arena group member and he was shot to death outside his home in Brooklyn. According to later claims, Scarpa received information from the FBI about Lampassi's location. Information that was then used to set up the hit, if true, and this remains disputed. It would mean that the FBI was effectively giving targeting intelligence that led directly to a murder. Agent DeVecchio has consistently denied giving such information. But testimony from many sources, including cooperating witnesses and even other FBI agents, suggested that the relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa had become deeply wrong. There were also claims that DeVecchio warned Scarpa about investigations and pending arrests, allowing him to take precautions or get rid of evidence. The FBI agent was supposed to be handling a spy, but the relationship appeared to have changed into something closer to a partnership or even a friendship. Other FBI agents noticed and raised concerns. Some reported their suspicions to supervisors, questioning whether DeVecchio had become too close to Scarpa. But these concerns were largely dismissed or ignored. DeVecchio was a respected supervisor. Scarpa was giving valuable intelligence, and nobody wanted to rock the boat years later. FBI documents would show that internal worries about the Scarpa-DeVecchio relationship went back to the 1980s. But the Bureau's organizational culture, its investment in Scarpa as a top echelon spy, and perhaps a reluctance to expose the full extent of the problem, all combined to prevent meaningful action. So the war continued, and people continued dying. And the FBI continued meeting with one of the men doing the killing. Perhaps the most tragic part of the Colombo War was that not all the victims were mobsters who had chosen this life. Innocent people were caught in the crossfire. On August 31, 1992, 18-year-old Dominic Masseria was sitting in a car with his older brother when gunmen approached and opened fire. Dominic was killed. His brother, who was connected to the Arena group, survived. But Dominic himself had no involvement in organized crime. He was simply a teenager who happened to be with his brother at the wrong time. On March 25, 1992, 69-year-old Mary Bari was inside a store when gunmen, apparently targeting someone else, opened fire on the street outside. A stray bullet came through the window and hit Mary, killing her. She had no connection to the mob at all. She was simply in the wrong place when the violence exploded. These innocent victims highlighted the broader cost of the Colombo War. It was not just mobsters killing each other. The violence was spilling over into the community, putting regular citizens at risk, and the FBI, which had intelligence about the ongoing conflict through their spy, faced real questions about whether they could have done more to prevent these deaths. Could the FBI have arrested Scarpa and others involved in the war before it got worse? Could they have warned possible victims? Could they have stepped in more aggressively to stop the violence? These questions were asked during later investigations and trials. The answers were complex and often unsatisfying. The FBI argued that they were building broader cases against the whole family, that they could not move too quickly without compromising investigations, that they were trying to protect their spy and his intelligence. Critics responded that the Bureau had put their spy relationship over public safety, that they had allowed murders to happen that they might have prevented, and that innocent people had died as a result. Both positions had elements of truth, and that complexity, the moral uncertainty of using spies, the difficult balance between intelligence gathering and law enforcement, would continue to haunt everyone involved by late 1992 and early 1993. The Colombo War was winding down largely because the Persico group had won. The Arena group had been destroyed. Some of their key members were dead, others were in hiding, and still others had been arrested. Victor Arena himself would eventually be convicted of racketeering and murder and sentenced to life in prison. Greg Scarpa had been key in the Persico victory. His willingness to use violence, his tactical planning, and his intelligence. Both his own observations and possibly information from the FBI had given the Persico group a decisive advantage. But Scarpa's victory came at a cost. He had made himself even more visible to law enforcement. The violence of the war had drawn massive police and FBI attention to the Colombo family. Multiple investigations were underway, and Scarpa was a main target of many of them. Moreover, his health was getting worse. The AIDS was progressing, and he was having more frequent infections and complications. The physical toll of the war, the stress, the violence, the constant alertness needed to avoid being killed had worn him down. He was visibly losing weight, his complexion was poor, and those close to him could see that he was a sick man. But perhaps most significantly, Scarpa's protection was beginning to fall apart. Other FBI agents aware of the claims about his activities during the war were pushing for his prosecution. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn was building cases against Colombo. Family members and Scarpa was increasingly difficult to leave out of those cases. The safety that had protected him for 3 decades was finally starting to fail. When the Colombo War finally ended in early 1993, the toll was staggering. At least 12 people were confirmed dead, with possibly more victims, whose murders were never officially connected to the conflict. Many more had been wounded in failed assassination attempts. Families were destroyed, not just the mobster families, but also the families of innocent victims caught in the violence. The war had also wrecked the Colombo family itself, what had once been a united, profitable criminal organization was now broken and under intense law enforcement watch. Many members were in prison, dead, or working with authorities. The family's criminal operations had been badly disrupted. For the broader New York mob, the Colombo War was a disaster. It had drawn attention to organized crime at a time when the FBI's investigations of the 5 families were already increasing. It had shown that even in the 1990s, even with all the law enforcement pressure, mob families could still tear themselves apart in orgies of violence. And for Greg Scarpa, the war was the beginning of the end. He had survived it. He had helped his group win. But in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The attention he had drawn, the enemies he had made, the evidence that had been collected, all of it was about to come crashing down on him. The Grim Reaper had cut down many victims over the years. Now finally, his own time was running out. On November 3, 1992, while the Colombo War was still technically going on, federal agents arrested Greg Scarpa. The charges were wide: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, extortion, and many other crimes. The indictment read like a list of Scarpa's criminal career, detailing decades of violence and criminal activity. For many in law enforcement, the arrest represented a triumph. A dangerous mob killer was finally being brought to justice. But for those aware of Scarpa's status as an FBI spy, the arrest was more complicated. What made it even more strange was the silence inside the bureau. Agents who had once relied on Scarpa's intelligence suddenly went quiet, pretending they barely knew him behind closed doors. Supervisors whispered about the possible fallout. Had Scarpa talked, really talked, he could bring down careers, expose internal failures, and show a level of wrongdoing that the FBI desperately wanted buried. Some within the Bureau feared that this arrest might start a scandal more damaging than Abscam or COINTELPRO, and the tension in federal offices was thick enough to cut with a knife. How would the government prosecute a man who had been working for them? How would they explain why he had been allowed to operate for so long? The answer at first was that they would not explain it. Scarpa's status as a spy was secret information, not to be told publicly. The prosecution would go on as if he were simply another mobster with no special relationship to the FBI. But that story could not be kept up for long. Scarpa, facing the possibility of life in prison, had to make a choice. Would he continue working with the government? Perhaps testifying against other mobsters in exchange for leniency? Or would he finally accept the life he had been pretending to live? The life of a stand-up mobster who never cooperated, remarkably, given his decades as a spy. Scarpa at first chose to fight the charges. He hired lawyers and prepared for trial. Perhaps he believed that the FBI would somehow protect him one more time. Perhaps he thought his spy status would become a shield, making it impossible for the government to prosecute him without exposing their own involvement. If so, he was mistaken. While waiting for trial, Scarpa's health continued its downward spiral. The AIDS was now advanced, and he was having multiple opportunistic infections. He was hospitalized multiple times. His weight had dropped dramatically. The man who had once been feared for his physical presence and ability for violence was now visibly dying. Prison doctors struggled to treat him. This was 1992 to 1993. And while some AIDS treatments were available, the truly effective combinations of antiretroviral drugs that would come out later in the 1990s were not yet available. Scarpa's outlook was clear. He was going to die probably within a year or two. This reality changed the dynamics of his case. What kind of sentence could the government seek against a man who was already dying? What reason did Scarpa have to cooperate when he knew his time was limited? Linda Skiro visited him in the prison hospital, and her later testimony described these visits. Scarpa was bitter, angry, and increasingly disconnected from reality. He ranted about betrayals, about the FBI abandoning him, about his enemies in the mob. The paranoia that had always been part of his personality had grown stronger with his illness. But even as he faced death, Scarpa apparently could not stop being what he was. There are accounts from this time suggesting that he tried to order hits from his hospital bed, sending messages through Linda and other visitors about people he wanted killed. Whether these messages were ever carried out is unclear. But the fact that he was apparently still trying to plan murders while dying in a prison hospital says a lot about who Greg Scarpa was. In 1993, as various cases against Colombo family members moved forward, Scarpa's defense lawyers made a strategic decision. They would expose his status as an FBI spy. The reveal was explosive. Defense lawyers argued that Scarpa's relationship with the FBI was so wide, so compromising that any prosecution of him was tainted. They argued that the FBI had protected Scarpa while he committed murders, that they had used him to target other mobsters, and that his arrest was hypocritical given his long service to the government. When news of Scarpa's spy status became public, the reaction in the mob world was shock and rage. Old-timers in Colombo and other families were stunned. Scarpa had been the example, the guy who never bent, never broke, who supposedly followed life with religious devotion. To learn that he had been feeding information to the FBI, while at the same time conducting murders, was like discovering a priest had been a government spy. Street soldiers cursed his name. Captains rewrote whole histories of sit-downs, hits, and power plays once they realized Scarpa may have been manipulating results not for the mob, but for the Bureau. For over 30 years, Scarpa had been going to mob meetings, taking part in murders, earning and sharing profits, all while informing the FBI how many mobsters had been arrested or killed based on information he gave, how many mob operations had been compromised. The Code of Omerta, the sacred promise never to work with authorities, was the foundation of La Cosa Nostra. Breaking it was considered the ultimate betrayal, worse than any other crime. And Greg Scarpa had not just broken it once or in a moment of weakness. He had systematically betrayed the mob for 30 years while continuing to benefit from his position in the family. Mobsters who had trusted him, who had worked with him, who had confided in him, now realized they had been dealing with a rat. Some who were already working with authorities themselves gave information about Scarpa's crimes, perhaps feeling less guilt about their own cooperation given Scarpa's betrayal. Multiple trials related to the Colombo War and other mob activities took place in 1993 and 1994. Scarpa was too ill to take part in most of them, but his name came up again and again. Cooperating witnesses testified about murders he had committed or ordered. Evidence was presented about his role in the war. One particularly important trial involved several Colombo family members charged with racketeering and murder. During this trial, the prosecution presented evidence about Scarpa's activities, and defense lawyers cross-examined witnesses about whether Scarpa had manipulated events with FBI help. These trials began to expose the full scope of what had happened during the Colombo War. Testimony showed that Scarpa had been meeting with Agent DeVecchio throughout the conflict. Questions were raised about what information had been shared and in which direction it had flowed. Agent DeVecchio was called to testify in some of these proceedings. He defended his handling of Scarpa, arguing that the spy had given valuable intelligence and that any suggestion of wrongdoing was unfounded. But under cross-examination, inconsistencies came out. DeVecchio's testimony about what he knew and when he knew it did not always line up with other evidence. The defense lawyers smelled blood. They pushed harder, trying to show that the FBI had been involved in the violence, that Scarpa had effectively captured his handlers, and that the government's hands were so dirty that their prosecution was not legitimate. Despite his failing health and the exposure of his spy status, Scarpa apparently continued trying to give information to authorities, according to some accounts. He offered to testify against other mobsters in exchange for better medical treatment or more lenient conditions of confinement. But by this point, Scarpa's value as a witness was questionable. His spy status was now public knowledge, which meant any testimony he gave would be attacked by defense lawyers as coming from a self-serving rat. His believability was destroyed, and his health was so poor that he might not survive long enough to testify. Even if he wanted to, there was something pathetic about this final phase of Scarpa's life. The man who had been so feared, who had killed so many people, was now reduced to a dying prisoner, desperate to trade information for small comforts. The power he had held was gone, the respect he had commanded, however much of it was based on fear, was replaced by contempt from both his former mob associates and the law enforcement officers who had used him. In his final months, Scarpa was moved to a medical facility for federal prisoners. He was now openly suffering from AIDS-related complications. The secrecy he had kept about his HIV status for years was gone, and he was receiving end-of-life care. Linda Skiro continued to visit, though their relationship was strained. She would later testify that Scarpa was angry and bitter, blaming everyone but himself for his situation. He blamed the FBI for not protecting him better. He blamed other mobsters for betraying him. He blamed the justice system for prosecuting him after all his years of service as a spy. What he apparently never did was accept responsibility for his own choices. The murders he had committed, the lives he had destroyed, the decades of violence and crime by early 1994. It was clear that Greg Scarpa did not have much time left. The AIDS had progressed to its final stages. He was suffering from multiple infections that his destroyed immune system could not fight. He was in constant pain, heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness on June 4, 1994. Gregory Scarpa Sr. died in the Federal Medical Center. He was 66 years old. The official cause of death was complications from AIDS, though in a broader sense. His death was the inevitable result of the life he had chosen. A life of violence that had eventually caught up with him. There was no mob funeral, no gathering of associates to pay respects. Scarpa's exposure as a spy had made him an outcast in that world. If any of his former mob colleagues felt grief at his passing, they kept it to themselves. More likely, they were relieved that he was gone, unable to give any more information to authorities. His family held a small private funeral. Connie was there, the wife he had married decades earlier and who had kept a respectable household. Even as Greg lived his double and triple lives, his children were there, struggling to make sense of the father they had known with the monster, whose crimes were now public knowledge. Linda Skiro attended as well, the mistress who had been with him through so much of his criminal career. She would later become a key witness for prosecutors, her testimony helping to unravel the full extent of Scarpa's crimes and his relationship with the FBI. And somewhere, presumably, Agent Lindley DeVecchio heard about his former spy's death. What he thought or felt, we can only guess, but DeVecchio's ordeal was far from over. Investigations into his relationship with Scarpa would continue for years, eventually leading to his own criminal prosecution. Greg Scarpa was dead, but the scandal he left behind was just beginning. In the years right after Scarpa's death, journalists and prosecutors began putting together the full story of his relationship with the FBI. What came out was shocking, even by the standards of organized crime cases. Documents showed that the FBI had known about Scarpa's violent activities for decades and had done little to stop him. Reports showed that he had given information about murders, including murders he himself committed, and that this information had been filed away rather than acted upon. The most explosive reveals concerned Agent Lindley DeVecchio. Testimony from Linda Skiro and others suggested that DeVecchio had given information to Scarpa that was used to target victims during the Colombo War. There were claims that DeVecchio had received gifts from Scarpa, expensive wine, cash payments disguised as spy fees that went over proper amounts, even jewelry, if these claims were true. They suggested that DeVecchio had not just been a handler who had lost control of his spy. He had possibly been a corrupt agent, actively helping in murders while on the FBI payroll. The FBI started internal investigations. The Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility looked at DeVecchio's conduct, and prosecutors began considering whether DeVecchio himself should face criminal charges. In 2006, more than a decade after Scarpa's death, former FBI agent Lindley DeVecchio was charged with 4 counts of murder in connection with his relationship with Greg Scarpa. Prosecutors claimed that DeVecchio had given information to Scarpa that led directly to 4 specific murders during the Colombo War. The case was based mainly on testimony from Linda Skiro, who described conversations she had overheard between Scarpa and DeVecchio, as well as statements Scarpa had made to her about receiving information from Lynn or Mr. D, names Scarpa supposedly used for DeVecchio. The prosecution argued that DeVecchio had become corrupted by his relationship with Scarpa, that he had crossed the line from handler to accomplice, and that he bore responsibility for the murders that resulted from the information he gave. DeVecchio's defense lawyers argued that this was a witch hunt, that Linda Skiro was an unreliable witness who was lying to help her own situation, and that DeVecchio had simply been doing his job managing a difficult spy in a complex situation. The trial, which took place in 2007, was a media sensation. Every day the courthouse steps turned into a stage. Reporters packed the hallways. Sketch artists tried to capture the tension, and former FBI agents showed up in suits to quietly support or silently judge their old colleague. Mob families tuned into every update, sensing that the trial might expose secrets they had long suspected. CABLE networks ran nightly segments titled Agent or Accomplice. The proceedings felt less like a criminal trial and more like a reckoning for decades of federal undercover practices. It exposed the inner workings of the FBI spy program and raised deep questions about how far law enforcement could go in growing criminal spies. In the end, DeVecchio was found not guilty on all counts. The jury apparently found Linda Skiro's testimony unconvincing. or they believed the defense's arguments that DeVecchio had been doing legitimate law enforcement work. The verdict was argued. Some saw it as justice, others as a failure to hold a corrupt agent responsible. After the not guilty verdict, DeVecchio wrote a book about his experiences, defending his actions and portraying himself as a dedicated agent who had been unfairly targeted. Critics argued that the book was self-serving and failed to acknowledge the serious problems with how Scarpa had been handled. The reveals about Scarpa's role as a spy had big impacts on many mob cases. Defense lawyers for mobsters who had been convicted filed motions for new trials, arguing that their clients' convictions were tainted by the FBI's use of Scarpa. In some cases, these arguments were successful. Convictions were overturned, sentences were reduced, or settlements were reached. The federal government ended up paying millions of dollars in legal settlements to defendants who could show that their cases had been compromised by the FBI's relationship with Scarpa. One particularly important case involved Victor Orena, the rival mob boss who had opposed Scarpa during the Colombo War. Orena's lawyers argued that he had effectively been set up by the FBI through Scarpa, that the war itself had been planned or at least helped by federal agents, and that Orena's conviction was therefore not valid. While Orena's murder conviction was finally upheld, the case highlighted how the FBI's use of Scarpa had possibly twisted justice in many prosecutions. How many defendants had been convicted based on evidence or intelligence that came from Scarpa? How many had been unable to defend themselves effectively because they did not know about the FBI's relationship with a key witness against them? These questions haunted the criminal justice system for years. The Scarpa scandal led to big reforms in how the FBI manages spies, especially top echelon spies. The Bureau put in stricter oversight procedures, better documentation requirements, and clearer guidelines about what crimes by spies could be tolerated and what needed immediate action. The FBI also set up better systems for sharing information between different units. One of the problems in the Scarpa case was that agents investigating murders that Scarpa committed often did not know that he was a spy for another part of the Bureau. Better information sharing was supposed to prevent such situations in the future. Additionally, the FBI created stronger systems for reviewing spy relationships, with supervisors required to regularly check whether a spy's value outweighed the costs and risks of keeping them. Whether these reforms have been effective is debatable. Later spy scandals, including the well-known case of James Whitey Bulger in Boston, who, like Scarpa, was a top echelon spy who committed many murders while working for the FBI, suggests that the problems may be systemic rather than case-specific. The basic tension remains. The FBI needs spies to fight organized crime, but those spies are themselves criminals. How do you use one criminal to catch others without becoming involved in crime yourself? The Scarpa case did not answer that question so much as expose how catastrophically wrong the approach can go. Greg Scarpa's son, Gregory Scarpa Jr., followed his father into organized crime and eventually into cooperation with the government, though in a very different way than his father. Scarpa Jr. was a made member of the Colombo family and was involved in serious crimes including murder. He was arrested and convicted in the 1990s and was facing a possible death sentence. In an effort to avoid execution, Scarpa Jr. became a government cooperator, giving information about other criminals. But Scarpa Jr.'s cooperation was unusual. While in prison, he was housed near Ramzi Youssef, one of the terrorists responsible for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Scarpa Jr. developed a relationship with Youssef and got information about terrorist plots, which he passed to the government. This information was supposedly valuable to national security investigations, and Scarpa Jr. argued that it should give him big sentence reductions. The government, however, was skeptical about both the value of the information and Scarpa Jr.'s reasons for giving it. Scarpa Jr. remains in federal prison as of this writing. still following legal ways for sentence reduction. His case is a strange footnote to his father's story. Another Scarpa manipulating his relationship with federal authorities, though in this case from a position of weakness rather than strength. As the full scope of Greg Scarpa's crimes and his FBI relationship became public, families of his victims began to speak out. Their stories were heartbreaking. Parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, families destroyed by Scarpa's violence. Some of these families filed civil lawsuits against the federal government, arguing that the FBI's protection of Scarpa had allowed the murders of their loved ones. In some cases, they received settlements. In others, their cases were dismissed on various legal grounds. One particularly moving account came from the family of Joseph Domenico, the Colombo associate Scarpa murdered in 1987 on suspicion of working with law enforcement. Domenico's family members spoke about the terrible irony. Their relative was killed for supposedly being a spy by a man who was actually the real spy, and the FBI had done nothing to prevent it. Even though they almost certainly knew Scarpa was planning the murder, the family of Mary Bari, the 69-year-old woman killed by a stray bullet during the Colombo War, also spoke publicly. They questioned how the FBI could have allowed the war to continue when they had a spy, Scarpa, giving intelligence about it. Could Mary Bari's death have been prevented if the FBI had acted more aggressively to stop the violence? These families represented the human cost of the FBI's devil's deal with Greg Scarpa. The Bureau's reason was always that Scarpa's intelligence served the greater good, that his information helped prosecute other dangerous criminals. But for the families of his victims, that greater good was cold comfort. Their loved ones were dead, and the government had protected the killer. The Greg Scarpa case raises deep ethical questions that remain unresolved. First, when is it acceptable to allow criminal activity by a spy? The FBI's position was that some criminal activity had to be overlooked to keep Scarpa's cover and usefulness. But where is the line? Is bookmaking acceptable? But murder is not. What about assault, extortion, or drug dealing? The FBI never made a clear standard, and in Scarpa's case, they seem to allow almost everything. Second, who decides when a spy has become more trouble than they are worth? Scarpa was committing murders while informing. At what point should the FBI have said, "This has gone too far. We need to prosecute this man regardless of his intelligence value"? The fact that this point apparently never came suggests a failure of judgment and responsibility. Third, how do you prevent handlers from becoming too close to their spies? The relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa appears to have gone beyond the professional distance that should exist between an agent and a criminal source. Were there systemic failures in supervision and oversight that allowed this to happen, and if so, have those failures been properly addressed? Fourth, what responsibility does the government bear for crimes committed by spies it protects? If the FBI knows a spy is committing crimes and chooses not to step in, is the Bureau involved in those crimes? Some legal experts argue yes, that the government cannot wash its hands of criminal activity it could have prevented. These questions do not have easy answers. They involve difficult trade-offs between public safety, effective law enforcement, and ethical government. The Scarpa case stands as a cautionary tale about what can happen when those trade-offs are made poorly. In the years since Scarpa's death, his story has been the subject of many books, documentaries, and articles. Journalists like Peter Lance have investigated the case widely, uncovering details that might otherwise have remained hidden in secret FBI files. True crime fans have been fascinated by Scarpa's story, the duality of his life, the boldness of his manipulation of the FBI, the sheer scope of his violence. But there is a risk in this fascination, a tendency to romanticize or sensationalize a man who was at his core a serial killer. Greg Scarpa murdered at least 50 people, and possibly many more. He tortured victims, he destroyed families. He used violence casually and without regret. The fact that he also worked with the FBI does not make him any less of a monster, if anything. It makes him more hateful as he betrayed everyone around him while continuing his violence. Some organized crime historians see Scarpa as an example of how the traditional mob was already dying by the 1990s. The old code of omerta, the idea of honor among thieves, was shown to be a fiction. Scarpa had broken every principle the mob claimed to uphold, and he had done so for decades without being detected. If a captain could be an FBI spy for 30 years, what did that say about the organization? Others see Scarpa as mainly an indictment of the FBI, evidence that the Bureau's war against organized crime had led to moral compromises that undermined the rule of law. By protecting a serial killer, by possibly helping him in targeting victims, the FBI had become involved in the very crimes it was supposed to prevent. Both views have merit. The Scarpa case is both a story about the corruption of the mob and the corruption of law enforcement. It is a story about what happens when expedience beats ethics, when the ends are seen as justifying any means. Perhaps the most lasting damage from the Scarpa case is its impact on public trust in law enforcement. When people learn that the FBI protected a serial killer for decades, that federal agents possibly helped in murders, it undermines confidence in the justice system. This erosion of trust has practical results. Witnesses become less willing to work with authorities if they believe that the FBI might be in bed with the criminals they are investigating. Juries become more skeptical of government witnesses and spies, making prosecutions more difficult. The Scarpa case also added to a broader pattern of FBI scandals involving spies. The parallels to the Whitey Bulger case in Boston are striking in both cases. Top echelon spies committed many murders while being protected by their FBI handlers. These were not isolated incidents, but rather systemic failures in how the Bureau managed its most sensitive sources. Rebuilding that trust requires transparency, responsibility, and shown reforms, even decades later. Community leaders still cite the Scarpa case when urging caution about trust in federal spy testimony. In neighborhoods long skeptical of law enforcement, the story became a modern legend, proof that the system was capable of protecting killers if it suited their goals. This psychological scar has shaped jury views, colored public debate, and stayed in the cultural memory like a stain that cannot be scrubbed out. The FBI has taken steps in that direction, but the legacy of cases like Scarpa's continues to cast a shadow over the Bureau's believability. Despite decades of investigations, trials, and reveals, there are still big gaps in our understanding of the full Scarpa story. We do not know exactly how many people Greg Scarpa killed. Guesses range from 50 to over 80. But without bodies or confessions, we will never have a precise count. There are probably victims whose families still do not know what happened to their loved ones. Cases that were never solved and bodies that will never be found. We do not know the full extent of what the FBI knew and when they knew it. While many documents have been released, others remain secret. There may be reports, memos, and watch records that would further show how much the Bureau knew about Scarpa's crimes and how they responded. We do not know definitely whether Agent DeVecchio gave information to Scarpa that was used to target murder victims. DeVecchio was found not guilty, which means the jury did not believe the prosecution's case was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But a not guilty verdict does not necessarily mean innocence. It means the evidence was not sufficient for conviction under the high standard required in criminal trials. The truth of what happened in those conversations between DeVecchio and Scarpa may never be fully known. We also do not know how many other cases like Scarpa's might exist. Was he unique? Or were there other top echelon spies who committed serious crimes while being protected by the FBI? The Bureau's culture of secrecy makes it difficult to answer that question with confidence. It is tempting when studying a case like Greg Scarpa's to try to understand him, to figure out what made him capable of such violence. Was it his upbringing, his environment, some natural psychological defect. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Scarpa grew up in a world where violence was normalized, where organized crime offered opportunities that real work did not, where power came from the willingness to hurt others. He joined the mob as a young man and quickly discovered that he was good at violence and that he enjoyed it. But many people grow up in similar circumstances and do not become serial killers. There was something particular about Greg Scarpa, some absence of empathy, some coldness at his core that allowed him to kill without regret. He could murder someone and then go home to his family dinner without any clear internal conflict. Psychologists would probably diagnose Scarpa as having antisocial personality disorder, what used to be called sociopathy or psychopathy. He showed the classic signs: superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, willingness to use violence, inability to form real emotional bonds. His relationships were transactional. What could people do for him? His family members were useful for keeping his cover of respectability. His mob associates were useful for criminal enterprises. His FBI handlers were useful for protection and information. When people were no longer useful, he got rid of them, often with a bullet. Understanding this helps explain Scarpa's behavior. But it does not excuse it. He made choices. He chose violence. He chose to become a killer. And he chose again and again over decades to continue killing even when he could have stopped. That is what makes Greg Scarpa truly chilling. He was not a monster who lost control. He was a monster who was always in control, who calculated his actions, and who chose evil methodically and repeatedly. If we are honest about Greg Scarpa's legacy, it must be measured mainly in the lives he destroyed. At least 50 people, probably more, murdered. Some were mobsters who had chosen a criminal life and understood the risks. But others were innocent. The young man killed in a card game argument, the woman hit by a stray bullet, the relatives of mobsters who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Beyond the direct victims, there are the families left behind. The children who grew up without fathers, the parents who buried their children, the spouses who became widows and widowers. The ripple effects of Scarpa's violence touched hundreds of lives, creating trauma and loss that lasted for generations. There's also the damage to institutions. The FBI's reputation was seriously hurt by the reveals about its protection of Scarpa. The criminal justice system was compromised by the taint of many prosecutions. Public trust in law enforcement was eroded, and finally, there's the moral cost. The corruption of principles, the compromise of ethics, the demonstration that sometimes the line between law enforcement and criminality becomes blurred to the point of meaninglessness. Against all this, what do we put on the other side of the ledger? The FBI would argue that Scarpa gave valuable intelligence that led to prosecutions of other dangerous criminals. That is true, as far as it goes. But when you weigh that intelligence against the cost, the murders, the corruption, the damage to justice, it is hard to argue that the deal was worth it. The FBI made a deal with the devil, and in the end, the devil won. Not because Scarpa avoided justice, he died in prison, but because the corruption of principles and the cost in lives can never be fully redeemed. Greg Scarpa died on June 4, 1994, in a federal medical facility, his body wrecked by AIDS, his reputation destroyed, his secrets exposed. The Grim Reaper had finally met death himself, but his story did not end there. It continues to echo decades later as a cautionary tale about the dangers of making moral compromises in pursuit of law enforcement goals. It stands as a reminder that the ends do not always justify the means, that some deals should never be made, and that protecting criminals in order to catch other criminals is a strategy full of peril. Greg Scarpa was a serial killer who murdered over 50 people. He was also an FBI spy who gave intelligence for over 30 years. These two facts are both true, and they exist in terrible tension with each other. He was protected by the government while committing murders. He helped prosecute other mobsters while being a mobster himself. He swore an oath of omerta while systematically breaking it for decades. In the end, Scarpa was loyal to no one and nothing except himself. He betrayed his mob family, his blood family, his FBI handlers, and every principle that any of these groups claimed to stand for. He was a man without honor in a world that pretended honor mattered. The FBI agents who handled him convinced themselves that the intelligence was worth it, that they were serving a greater good. Maybe they believed that at the time, or maybe they knew better, but did not want to admit that they had lost control of their spy, that he was using them as much as they were using him. Agent Lindley DeVecchio was found not guilty of criminal charges, but questions about his relationship with Scarpa will follow him for the rest of his life. Was he a dedicated agent who got too close to a dangerous spy? Or was he a corrupt agent who became involved in murder? The jury said not guilty, but in the court of public opinion, the verdict is still out for the families of Scarpa's victims. There can never be true justice. Their loved ones are dead, and knowing that their killer has also died gives only cold comfort. Some received financial settlements from the government, money compensation for lives that can never be replaced. Others received nothing but the bitter knowledge that the FBI protected their loved one's killer for decades. The Colombo crime family never fully recovered from the war that Scarpa helped plan. It remains one of the 5 families, but it is a shadow of its former self, depleted by prosecutions, internal conflicts, and the corrosive knowledge that one of its most trusted captains was a spy. And what of Greg Scarpa's own family? His children must live with the knowledge of what their father was. Some have tried to distance themselves from his legacy, changing their names and building new lives. Others, like Greg Scarpa Jr., followed him into crime in cooperation with authorities. Continuing the twisted family tradition, Linda Skiro, the mistress who saw so much of Scarpa's criminal career, eventually testified against him and against Agent DeVecchio. She gave crucial evidence about murders and about the FBI relationship. But she must also live with the knowledge that she stood by while Scarpa committed those murders, that she accepted the lifestyle his crimes provided, that she was involved through her silence. If there is a lesson in Greg Scarpa's story, it is this: evil compounds one bad decision. The FBI's decision to recruit and protect a violent mobster led to decades of murder and corruption. The initial reason that his intelligence was valuable blinded people to the mounting cost. And by the time the true price became clear, it was too late to undo the damage. The Grim Reaper is gone. But the questions he raised remain. How far should law enforcement go in growing criminal spies? What crimes are acceptable to allow in pursuit of prosecuting other crimes? Who watches the watchers? And when the watchers become involved in the crimes they are supposed to prevent, who holds them responsible? Greg Scarpa's story remains one of the most argued chapters in both Mafia and FBI history. A man who killed over 50 people while being protected by the very agency meant to stop him. It is a story that should never have happened. A cautionary tale written in blood about the corruption of principles and the cost of moral compromise. If this story has kept you engaged, make sure you are subscribed for more deep dives into organized crime history. What did you think? Was Scarpa a useful spy, or did the FBI become involved in murder? Leave your thoughts below, and remember, the Scarpa case is not just history. It is a reminder that the institutions we trust to protect us can themselves become dangerous when they lose sight of their principles. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.